This over here is the Zotac RTX 5070 Ti. This is the AMP Extreme, and I think this GPU is gonna be the best option for most people. I'll explain that more in a minute, but this graphics card promises to gaming and beyond. Well, we're gonna be focusing on the beyond bit because I couldn't care less about gaming. So how does this 5070 Ti perform for creators, and should you maybe consider some alternatives? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be finding out. Let's go. This part of the video is brought to you by Asus ProArt PX13, the ultimate 2-in-1 creator laptop with AMD Ryzen 9 AI CPU and Nvidia RTX 4070 GPU. The PX13 is one of the most compact and powerful 13-inch laptops out there. Create smarter and faster from anywhere with AI features and military-grade toughness. Go check out our full overview in the video description below. There's a few very important things that we need to get out and off my chest. Number one, this 5070 Ti can't be compared with the 4070 Ti. Why? Because it's like comparing 4080 with 4090. They are actually completely different GPUs. And do you remember the 40 series drama we had with the 4080 series? There was two 4080s, and then one of them was actually 4070 Ti Super, that type of thing. Nvidia secretly is trying to do the same thing here with the 50 series. Let me explain. This 5070 Ti has the same GPU die or name as the 5080. In fact, this 5070 Ti is 5080, but a binned or cut down version, meaning that out of the factory they all came out as 5080s, but then when testing the 5080 they realized that perhaps some of the things on the GPU aren't working, so they turned some of these cores off that aren't working, and then voila, you get the 5070 Ti. The 4070 Ti is actually a different die. You can look at the die sizes and then you'll know. The 5070 Ti and the 5080 have exactly the same die size, which just shows that they're the same. And it's the same name GB203 for both of the 5070 Ti and 5080. Now, 4070 Ti and 4070 Ti Super, they are completely separate things. The direct predecessor for this 5070 Ti is 4070 Ti Super, which I have over here, this palette version. If you wanted to compare this 5070 Ti to 4070 Ti, of course it's going to look better because there are different class GPUs. So in terms of car sense, it's like comparing M3 to M5. Of course, the M5 is going to look a lot better compared to the M3 instead of M5. Does that make sense? I've seen a lot of reviewers make that comparison online already, and Nvidia did it themselves as well, but I don't think this is the right approach. Second massive thing to acknowledge, and this might not be the problem for you in the future, but right now, at the point of me making this video, there's a bit of a problem with MSRP. It should be MGRP, manufacturer guessing retail price. Oh my goodness, the pricing is absolutely insane. So basically this card here should be $750, but what it actually is roughly around 1,000, some of them even more. It costs a lot more than $750. Now, why? There's a few reasons, and let's explore them a little bit. What some of the news articles are reporting is that Nvidia actually stopped the 40 series production the end of last year, 2024. 4090, 4080 earlier in October, and then the 4070 kind of lineup earlier in December. Which means that basically there is no previous generation, there is just the new one, because they're using the same node. It's the same 4N process, which means that there's no more transistors, or we haven't improved in terms of the power efficiency in the pure transistor count, if that makes sense. And I believe Nvidia knew exactly what was going to happen, and they like to do that. In terms of business, it kind of makes sense. It's a little bit sneaky, and we as end customers are paying the price, but in terms of business, it's a clever move. If you don't know what's happening, basically they are reducing the availability of their product. So they've stopped the 40 series, which means that the actual availability of 40 series goes down, which means prices are going up of the 40 series, and they become more and more scarce because people are like, what's going on? It gets more expensive. Now, the 50 series then looks a lot better when it's launched because the pricing of the previous generation goes higher. Right now, the availability is crap anyway, But it's a clever way to make the new product look a little bit better. But also, it's very interesting that Nvidia doesn't have 2 generations of GPUs kind of running at the same time. If you look at the CPUs like Intel or AMD, AMD still produces like the last generation CPUs. Why not? If you can and you can still make money of it, why not sell the last generation as well rather than new one? But Nvidia probably knows that they can't produce 2 separate generations, and because anybody will buy everything anyway, why not just produce the new series and then make the most money out of it? My question is, why release the new GPUs in January and February where historically people have the lowest buying power? Christmas has just been, holidays has just been, people's wallets are empty. Why release a new generation of GPUs in February? I don't know. Another thing that doesn't help the availability is releasing it during Chinese New Year, where a lot of the factories close, so the availability of the 50 series is very low. Anyway, here we are, availability absolutely low, scalping absolute highest again. Pricing for these absolute highest. Hopefully in the future this changes, but I've got some good news for creators, or at least something that would make you feel better. The support for 50 series on your creative application is not there yet. It's been about a month since the first 50 series got launched, but right now at this point in time, 20th of February, we still don't have support in Adobe Premiere Pro. Yes, you can put it in and technically it works, but not all the features that you're buying this card for, they don't work. DaVinci Resolve, yes, we as reviewers have the pre-released version, but that's not available publicly. So when you are getting this, or me trying to install the latest version of DaVinci Resolve, it's not actually working either. Octane Render, not working. Redshift, not working. So as you can see, don't feel too bad if you wanted to buy the 50 series GPU, because there's no point in buying this right now anyway. And the software support kind of helps that, because when you want to get it, it is not going to work anyway. But if you want to build yourself some best bang for buck creator PCs, there is some very good options in the description below. I've created some build guides that are a lot more affordable, but still help you to build something right now that are available and really, really good performance. So go check them out. So let's look under the hood, what is actually happening in terms of specs. So what I'm comparing here is 4070 Ti, 4070 Ti Super, so you can see that these are separate GPUs. We've got RTX 5070 Ti and RTX 5080, so we can see how much have we cut down. So if we focus on the 5070 Ti and 5080, you can see that they're the same GPU name, and the die size is exactly the same by square millimeter. So it comes from the same. If you look at the 4070 Ti Super, you can see that the die size is actually the same as 5070 Ti. So that's where we actually comparing this with. But then the 4070 Ti has a lot smaller die, so it's completely different. The naming AD104 is also different. So usually you have, Ada Lovelace, that's why the AD, and then 103, which will be the 4080 kind of lineup, and then the 4070 Ti Super. The same, we have GB203 between these two, just so you understand what's happening. So when Nvidia is saying, yeah, we get extra VRAM, no, we don't get extra VRAM. It's just comparing the wrong things. You don't get extra VRAM compared to the previous generation. Just because you name the GPU different doesn't mean that you get something extra. Anyway, you can see the CUDA cores have actually increased compared to the 4070 Ti, slightly more, and slightly less compared to the 5080. So you can see we've reduced a little bit of them, cut them down a little bit. Tensor cores a little bit lower than the 5080 and a little bit more than the 4070 Ti. And the CUDA cores a little bit more compared to the 4070 Ti Super. If you compare it to the 4070 Ti, then obviously the 5070 Ti looks better, but that's not what we're doing over here. So what else has changed is we've got the RT cores, and the generation of the RT cores have gone up. So we've got Gen 4 now, as well as GDDR7. GDDR7 is a lot faster video memory that they've slapped onto this. And this could also potentially be one of the reasons why there's so little availability. GDDR7 is a new technology in the market as well. So now board partners and Nvidia, when they want to release the GPUs, they're not just depending on Nvidia to give them this, but also Samsung and some of these other GDDR7 manufacturers who actually give you them the memory chips as well to slap on the GPU. And there are some reports that the GDDR7 availability is not as widely available as you might think, so that could be another reason. If you look at the actual VRAM, you can see we've got the same as 4070 Ti Super and 5080. That's one of the reasons why I think the 5070 Ti is the sweet spot for most of the people, because in essence, It's 5080, just a little bit cheaper, but a lot closer to the performance with 5080 compared to the price. So in terms of bang for buck, you're getting the best one out of 5070 Ti. And that's what I kept saying about the 4070 Ti Super. It's probably one of the sweet spot for most creators out there. The memory bus is the same 256-bit, but because of the GDDR7, the actual memory bandwidth has gone up almost to 900 gigabytes per second, which is quite a big increase compared to the 4070 Ti Super. The bus interface is PCIe 5.0 16 underneath. Ideally, you want a platform that supports PCIe Gen 5. One of the other little thing that has changed is the L2 cache is higher compared to the 4070 Ti, and it's increased from 48 megabytes to 64 megabytes, which is the same as on the 5080. In terms of TDP, it pulls 300 watts, which is 15 watts more than the 4070 Ti, and should cost around $750. Now that's a big asterisk in there. That's a big ass asterisk. If you dare to check out the pricing and leave me some nice angry comments about the pricing, please do. I would love to hear them. Comment below. I'll see you down there. I'll join in. Now it's time to start testing this, and we have to talk about the testing setup. Now I've got a little bit of an interesting setup. It's a 12900K. I'm using DDR4 platform, which is Z690 ASUS Strix. We're using 64 gigabytes of Kingston Fury Beast 3600 MHz RAM. We've got a 360mm cooler Arctic Liquid Freezer 2, Samsung 980 Pro for the operating system, and a 1200 watt Be Quiet power supply that provides enough juice for this here now. But which GPUs are we actually comparing here? Number one, I want to know how much performance we actually lose compared to the 5080, which we have here. This is the Zotac Solid 5080. Secondly, I want to know how much performance we're gaining compared to the previous generation 4070 Ti Super. Not 4070 Ti, but Ti Super. At this price point, we might as well check out some of the other teams, like the Team Red. This is the 7900XT from ASUS TUF, but this is an AMD card and it's got 20 gigabytes of VRAM, even more. So the question is, would you actually buy this? Because you can get this for even cheaper than any of these cards here. Go check out the pricing for this in the video description below, because I'm seeing some crazy deals on right now. So now the performance. First, we're looking at Geekbench 6, and we can see that the 4070 Ti Super is about 4% slower, 3-4% slower in this OpenCL score, about 7 to 8% slower in the Vulkan scores. Doesn't look that good of an improvement. The 7900XT is 36% slower in the OpenCL and about 6.4% slower in the Vulkan score. The 58 is about 12 to 13% faster in these scores. Let's take a look at the AI scores. Geekbench 6 AI, because AI is one of the biggest things that Nvidia talks about this card. So let's take a look. The 4070 Ti Super is about 2.7% slower in the single, about 15% slower in the half, and about 4% slower in the quantized. Not that big of a difference. Interestingly though, as much as we love AI, the 7900XT is about 2% faster in single, about 30% slower in the half, but about 4.7% faster in the quantized. So the AI scores, Nvidia might not be winning at the price point here. Looking at the 5080, we're roughly about 6 to 10% faster in the single, half, and quantized scores, which means not that big of an improvement, but the price point of the 5080 is much higher on the AI. Let's move on to photo editing. Firstly, we've got Photoshop here, and the 4070 Ti Super is about 4% slower in the overall scores. The filter score is about 7.4% slower, but it's not that big of a difference. Interestingly, the AMD card is slightly faster in the overall score, about 2%, roughly about the same as the 5080. So the 5080 and 4070 Ti, the best cards here kind of perform exactly the same. There's no real difference what we see in Photoshop. Now, very important to mention that these tests here for Photoshop test the general score of what you might be doing. Now, there are specific tasks in Photoshop that can be accelerated on the GPU and some of the AI things, which mean that in these specific workflows you might see a bigger increase compared to the previous one, but generally that's what you can expect. Moving on to Lightroom Classic, the 4070 Ti Super is 2.5% faster in the overall score. Wait a second. Yes, the new version is actually slightly slower for some reason. Active score is about 5 to 6% faster again on the 4070 Ti, and passive score roughly about the same. So in terms of increase in Lightroom Classic, not real difference. Again, there are certain tasks in Lightroom Classic that can actually accelerate this. Now, even though on passive score we do exporting and panoramas put together, but there are certain things like AI denoising that can be accelerated on the GPU as well. And in them specific tasks, you might see the 5070 Ti a little bit faster, but generally everything concluded, it's not that much faster. The 7900XT is actually 3.6% faster in the overall score, so what gives? 5080 is 4.4% slower than the 5070 Ti. So as you can see, for photo editing in Lightroom Classic, we're getting a little bit of a mixed bag, but within 5% of all of these cards, AMD looks to be the best one because of the price point. Moving on to video editing, and here we've got to mention the actual decoders and encoders, or the media engines inside the GPU, because this 5070 Ti has got one decoder and two encoders. And that's the same case what we had on the 4070 Ti Super. But the new encoders and decoders are the next generation, which supports better quality at the same bit rate and faster because they're a new generation, as well as some new hardware codec support. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I highly recommend going to check out the 5090 review on my channel, where I'm gonna go more in depth why it's so important that it supports these specific codecs and acceleration of these codecs, and why the 50 series is so much more special than the 40 series. Now, that being said, at this point of me making the video, like I mentioned earlier on, Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, V-Ray, Redshift, and a lot of the others aren't exactly supported for the 50 series. V-Ray 5 is, but V-Ray 6 gets a bit odd CUDA core scores. What you're seeing here is not the full performance of the 50 series. Once we get the full update from the software, then the 50 series is going to jump even more. This right now is the unsupported software, but that's right now what we have to test. We don't know when it's going to be available, so don't feel too down that these GPUs aren't available, because as creators, you can't even utilize them, if that makes sense. Looking at Premiere Pro, the 4070 Ti Super is 1 to 3% slower in the overall score. Not a big difference. Not a difference at all, just within the margin of error, so you can say they perform the same. Bear in mind, once the software gets upgraded, then we get a much better performance on the 50 series. The 7900XT is about 9 to 11% slower in the standard and extended overall scores, which is interesting. I did not expect that. Long GOP score is 10% faster though, and interframe is 11% faster. At the same time, raw and GPU scores are a little bit lower. But if you're working with long GOP and interframe, then the AMD card is a very interesting option for you here. The 5080 right now in the unsupported software is about 2 to 3% faster, so not that much of a difference. Interestingly, the GPU effects are about 10% faster, which is quite interesting there. I didn't expect there to be that big of a difference, but apparently there is. Now, when the software gets released for the full update, are we going to see that much better performance? Don't know. Moving on to After Effects, 4070 Ti Super is about 3% slower, 7900XT is about 8% slower, 5080 is about 3% slower. The 5070 Ti is the fastest in the bunch and the most interesting scores I can see here. Now in After Effects, again, GPU doesn't matter as much as RAM and CPU cores if you want to do better rendering, get better performance. So, you know, you should know about that. So spend your budget on more RAM and better CPU if you're doing After Effects. In DaVinci Resolve, things get slightly interesting because this version of DaVinci Resolve actually supports the 50 series playback. Now, this is not publicly available for, you know, normal people, but the special bunch who can review these GPUs, I actually use that version of this. And now we can see that the 4070 Ti Super is about 10 to 15% slower in the overall scores, which is pretty impressive. The long GOP score, which actually shows us the H.264 and 5 codec and 422 10-bit performance, is 38% slower. That is amazing performance from the 5070 Ti, and that's one of the main reasons why I think the 50 series can be an interesting switch for some of the video editors because of the special codec support. The 7900XT interestingly performs actually better than the 4070 Ti Super and is about 5 to 17% slower depending on what you're doing scores. Now AI score is quite a bit lower on the 7900XT, and so is the long GOP score, but the price point for the AMD GPU is still interesting. Moving on to 5080, the 5080 is not that much better than the 5070 Ti. It's about 4 to 5, 6% faster in the overall scores. We see a little bit of a tick in the raw and GPU effect scores where we're peaking 10 to 13% faster than the 5070 Ti. The GPU effects are about 13% faster on the 5080, which is actually quite all right, and that's where we can see really the generational or like kind of a different model jump between these. That's one of the biggest difference you're gonna see in there. In AI, we're 8% faster, but in DaVinci Resolve, we can really see these cards stretch the legs, show the full support, and we can see why the 50 series have an increase over the 40 series, especially in the long GOP scores, which means your mirrorless camera codecs, H.264, 5, 10-bit especially, is going to be so much better. Now, moving on to 3D. And here I saw some comments on the earlier videos that why am I testing Blender 3.6 rather than 4.3? Well, here's the reason why. So when testing on Blender 4.3 and 3.6, I can see that the 3.6 is considerably faster than the 4.3. As you can see, 3.6 is 17.7% faster in the monster scene, about 16.6% faster junk shop scene, 10% faster in the classroom scene. That is the difference between different generations or different models of the GPU. And because I didn't want the newer GPUs to show slower, showing them on 3.6 kind of made more sense to me. So in Blender 3.6 then, the 4070 Ti Super is only about 1% slower in the monster scene, 7% slower in the junk shop scene, and about 2.2% slower in the classroom scene. So in 3D, here in Blender, I'm not seeing that big of a performance increase. Obviously, AMD here gets beat quite a lot because, you know, that isn't the strong suit for the 7900XT, and it's kind of embarrassing here, but you know that for 3D you're not going to get this AMD GPU, you're more getting it for video and photo editing, not 3D. Compared to 5080, which is 18 to 22% faster in these scenes, it's not a bad increase going to 5080. Now, Octane Bench, not supported right now. Redshift, not supported right now. So even when you're working in 3D, just depending what your workflow is, it might not be supported for you. V-Ray, I'm testing it on the V-Ray 5, which actually is supported on the new 50 series. And we can see that the 4070 Ti is 11 to 18% slower in the RTX and CUDA scores. Interestingly, I would have expected the RTX score to be the bigger increase because of the new RT cores, but the CUDA cores is actually where we see the most increase. As you can see, the AMD unfortunately isn't supported there, and the 5080 is about 15% faster than the 5070 Ti and CUDA and RTX scores. Now let's talk about the power draw. This Zotac Amp Extreme 5070 Ti is pulling 300 watts. The performance of the card is really, really good. It cools it down perfectly well, and it's got no issues whatsoever. As you can see, even in a hot room, I'm not seeing over 60, 70 degrees. It's fantastic. And the fan speed is absolutely minimal, and there is so much more cooling performance in store. Now, I noticed that when going to MSI Afterburner, there is quite a bit of performance that you can overclock. There is 15% of power, and let this card pull 345 watts, which is 45 watt extra power, which is quite ridiculous. So if you're an overclocker, you might get some extra juice out of it. But for creators, it doesn't make a difference. Honestly, when looking at the cards, there are OC cards that are more expensive. Like this OC card, I wasn't able to release the review because it's an OC card compared to the non-OC card version. Can I be honest? For creators, there's absolutely no difference. Okay, you can get higher clock speeds, but the rendering performance is going to be within margin of error, and you're not going to see it. So paying extra for an OC card, not really worth it. Okay, so don't waste your money on an OC card thinking you're going to get so much faster performance. Just get the cheapest card, but not just any card. Just do some research online, because some cards might have some issues or not that good build quality. As long as the card has good build quality, there's no difference between OC or non-OC cards. But at the same time, there is quite a bit of OC headroom on the 5070 Ti. So let's conclude the performance here. And I've got to say, in photo editing, honestly, between these cards, there's no real difference. I'd go with the AMD because it's the cheapest. It kind of makes sense. For video editing, even then, the AMD 7900XT kind of makes sense just because of the price point. Right now, these 50 series are so expensive, and because the 40 series aren't, produced anymore, we don't have the previous generation that's priced lower than the new generation. We just pay the premium all the time. You're gonna have to go with AMD if you want the best bang for buck. Now, there are certain aspects where the 50 series is a lot better. Hopefully by this time when you're watching this, the software supports that. I'm super excited that the 422 10-bit support is now on the 50 series, because that will make your timeline super fast, even when you're on the AMD CPU platform and you don't have Intel QuickSync. This 50 series will provide you that. Obviously for 3D, the Nvidia is so much better than AMD, and going with Nvidia is a lot better option. I'm just a little bit annoyed that the 4070 Ti Super is not produced anymore, because it would be really good value aspect if we had it on a lower price, but because it gets replaced with the 5070 Ti, I don't expect the 4070 Ti Super to lower in price, which is a sad thing, and we just have to constantly pay the latest pricing for all of these. If you want to check out the latest pricing, I'm going to leave the links in the description below, but I want to check out the different designs of these models as well, because that's quite interesting. So what I have over here is a 4070 Ti Extreme Amp. So the same like high-end model of Zotac, which is exactly the same as the 4070 Ti Super. I'm happy that we have actually shrink in size a little bit. You can see that the 5070 Ti is slightly smaller. We've gone a little bit more square. And look, the fan blades have actually gone smaller as well. They've increased the heatsink. The heatsink has gone deeper. Obviously the length here is roughly about the same, the thickness of the card, but the fan depth on the 4070 Ti, there's so much deeper and thicker fans than on the newer version. And if we compare the 5080, this is the solid version from Zotac, and this is the Extreme Amp on the 5070 Ti. Interestingly, the solid and the non-solid version, they look very similar. I really like the way the solid looks. It's just less RGB and kind of a gray cold theme. Looking on the side of these cards, quite a bit different. Obviously, we've gone from that less McLaren-y look to more kind of a straight look. We still have this gold on both of them, the solid and the non-solid version. The non-solid has an RGB on this side, and the pass-through is maybe a little bit even bigger on this, but the same dual BIOS and then RGB switch just in there, and then the gold spine goes all the way around to make this very rigid and the card not bending or anything. And when looking at the ends of the cards, you can see that our 50 series have actually shrunk a little bit. This Zotac design was absolutely massive, and you can see it is almost like an inch taller than the rest of them. On Zotac here, we have this infinity mirror design, and it looks really cool if you like the RGB. I'm personally a fan of non-RGB, and this without RGB design, this just looks really cool to me. And when looking at the top of these GPU designs, you can see that the solid, and this is the Extreme Amp version. The solid version is a little bit bigger than the Extreme Amp version, but the Extreme Amp has, I think, a little bit of a better pass-through. As you can see, less of this is covered compared to the solid version, and there is a few more holes in there. These triangle holes, I'm not sure why these are there, but I really like this kind of a gold feel to it. Interestingly, these materials feel slightly different. They don't look exactly the same. This has got a bit more green to it, than this is more silvery. And you've got the Zotac Gaming on that side, and we don't have that on the solid version. Solid is a little bit more minimal and less RGB compared to the Extreme Amp. But both of these cards, actually, I prefer the new design so much more than the old design. I didn't quite like these big curves, and not really for me. And I love that they got rid of this live to game thing, because a little bit cheese. Overall, my conclusion of conclusions is that it's actually a very interesting GPU, and it's an interesting sweet spot if everything in terms of pricing worked, because it's basically a baby 5080, or let's talk now as if the pricing is what MSRP is, not MGRP, manufacturer guessing the retail pricing. Then the 5070 Ti is the perfect sweet spot to get kind of the 5080 performance, but pay $250 less, which is quite a big chunk. That's 25% less pricing, but very close in performance, and that's why I think it's amazing. But if we go down the next step to 5070, then we're starting to lose the VRAM, and we don't get 16 gigabytes anymore. But here we get the same amount as on the 5080, which is fantastic. Let's just hope that Nvidia absolutely cranks these factories up in there, and then we're going to produce a heck ton of 50 series, and then we're going to be all happy. I'm sure we would all like that. And if you do, hit that like button. If you don't, hit that like button twice. And if you've seen all the videos on the channel, consider becoming a member, because there's some extra videos available early for the channel members. Okay, bye-bye.